Good morning. Welcome to the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, to this truly exciting session, Learning from Disorder. Today we're going to talk about how we can regulate, design and facilitate what cannot be anticipated, but will surely improve our cities. This exciting session will be facilitated and hosted by Placemaking Europe together with the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. And we're here to talk to two very exciting experts today. Pablo Sendra, who's an Associate Professor of Planning and Urban Design at University College London, and Abad Ocubillo, Senior Planner and Urban Designer at the San Francisco Planning Department. As said before, placemaking is a practice that normally works within a very flexible planning structure, and that it doesn't always match very well with the bureaucracy. So today we'll be talking about how, especially for recovery after COVID, we will be talking about how to make our planning structures more flexible in the future. I'm going to invite the first speaker with us. As said before, Pablo Sendra. He will introduce his latest book, Designing Disorder. He wrote recently with Richard Sennet, and his previous research on design strategies that encourage unplanned activities and sociability in the public realm. Welcome, Pablo.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen now to show a presentation. Thank you to the organization of Creative Bureaucracies for inviting me to this event. I'm going to speak about the motivations for writing this book, Designing Disorder, which I co-wrote with Richard Sennet. And then I'm going to go very quickly through the proposals explained in the book. And then in the Q&A, we can go deeper into some of the topics that I discuss in the book. I first read the book Designing the Uses of Disorder by Richard Sennet when I was 25 years old, the same age as Richard when he wrote the book. It was 2009 when the crisis of capitalism and the economic recession were bringing a period of uncertainty, and also an opportunity for social movements like the 15M in Spain or the Occupy movement in the US. I was an urban design master's student at that time. I saw many connections between the situation that Richard described in his book and the present time, both in the sociopolitical situation and in urban planning. 50 years after the book was published, regeneration schemes still seek to remove unwanted behavior and tend to domesticate informality. The validity of the book's arguments 50 years later made me question, can architects and planners design disorder? But what do we mean by disorder? I think this is something very important to understand in terms of what Richard and I mean by disorder when we speak in the book. We don't mean disorderly architectural forms like in postmodernism. What we mean is the contestation of imposed orders. And these orders that are contested, these orders that we propose to contest, are different in the 1960s from what they are today. They're related, but they are different. And we use in the book the example of the Westway, which is a motorway that crosses over North Kensington in London, and how the contestation to impose orders have evolved in the last 50 years, since Richard actually wrote the book. In the 1960s, the imposed order was the construction of a motorway that would cut the neighborhood in two. And currently, the imposed orders are gentrification and the disposal of community assets. These two situations, the construction of urban motorways in the 1960s and gentrification processes and real estate urbanism today, illustrate the kinds of disorder, the proposals in this book aim to contest. In both periods, activism creatively contested the imposed order through the occupation of spaces and through creating deregulated spaces like the ones Richard explained in his book in 1970. But how do we take these local actions into citywide scale. What we propose in the book, what Richard and I propose in the book, is the anarchic city. And the anarchic city could work through networks and municipalism. In an anarchic city, grassroots initiatives should be encouraged and supported. These grassroots initiatives would be independent from each other. They operate independently, but they are in a network. They exchange knowledge and resources with other initiatives. Network is the opposite of a scaling up, because if we think about scaling up the infrastructures for disorder, we will be imposing orders again. We will become, there will be again with big structures that replicate closed institutions where powers is concentrated in a few. In London, there are some examples of these networks, like the Network Justice Space here in the picture, that brings together many different organizations and many different views. I've collaborated with them in various occasions. But the role of the municipality to encourage these grassroots initiatives is also very important. And I normally use the example of Barcelona, particularly when Ada Colau, who is the mayor of Barcelona since 2015, she speaks about and recognizes the importance of social movements in the achievements of the local authorities. So how social movements have lobbied the municipality in certain directions, and how this is very important for municipalism as well. And also municipalities have the role to ensure that no one is left behind, that resources are distributed equally. So as an architect and urban designer, since I was actually 25 years old, 12 years ago when I read Richard's book, I wanted to put these ideas into drawings and words as well. So that's why the first chapter of my part of the book is called From the Paper to the Plan. How can we take these ideas of disorder, of deregulated spaces, of spaces where people learn how to tolerate difference, that encourage social interaction and the emergence of applying activities, how can we take them from the paper to the plan? But I soon faced a contradiction, which is, how can we design disorder if disorder itself if design itself tends to introduce order in the public space? My response to this contradiction was starting from the infrastructure, because the infrastructure creates conditions and provide possibilities. So I came out with this concept of infrastructures or disorder, which you can read the definition on the screen, which are initial interventions that create conditions for unplanned use of the public realm, which are points of departure for a continuous and open process. And I tried to divide these pieces of infrastructure that are both physical and social infrastructure in 4 categories: below ground, above ground, disorder in section, and process and flux, which basically explains, the last part explains how to implement these infrastructures for disorder. In the chapter below, I explain the first set of strategies to turn a city that works as what Richard Sennet described as a closed system into an open system. Through reassembling the infrastructure, which means rearranging its elements, the strategies aim to make the infrastructure more visible, accessible, and open, more collectively managed, because if it's collectively managed, it provokes collective awareness, negotiations, cooperations, relationships of solidarity and social interaction. An infrastructure also that provoke disruptions, that provoke these negotiations, and which have the capacity to grow, adapt, and change and be upgraded. Then the infrastructures above explore the interactions that take place above ground as the result of this infrastructure provision in the below ground, explore how to turn the public space into a flexible system that can be modified when different elements can be added, where different areas of the surface have diverse types of infrastructure and foundations to plug in its infrastructural elements. So each part of the infrastructure have different qualities, capabilities, and provide different possibilities. Then the strategies or the infrastructures that are in section, they aim to turn a city that works as a closed system into an open system, both in the longitudinal section and in the cross section, making an analogy to architectural drawings. In the longitudinal section, they aim to eliminate divisions, create a narrative of experiences, and these experiences can be created through generating different kinds of situation and provoking small disruptions that break the boundaries that are currently in many urban situations. These diverse experiences are explored in detail in the cross section. In the cross section, we propose to introduce elements that disrupt the current segregated spaces. And we also propose building light structures and constructions that have the capacity to grow, as we propose in these kind of illustrations. Finally, the chapter Process Flux explains the process of how to build these infrastructures for disorder. And I divide the chapter mainly in two parts. First, on initial interventions or disruptions that provoke these negotiations. And for this, it's important to understand the existing processes and activities that are taking place and the history of the place as well. And also to propose, based on this knowledge on the history of the place, for which is very important to provoke and to produce a research on what's going on with the community. Propose shared resources that provoke these negotiations. So understanding what is that in order to propose shared resources. And then the next step, the second part of this chapter, is on designing for uncertainty, which means that the strategies as explained on this book will have unpredictable outputs. And these unpredictable outputs need to be seen as something positive. So the architect, the urban designer, the planner needs to understand these uncertainties as something very positive, as part of our professional duty and a part of the risk that we need to take. And understanding that these infrastructure for disorder work as an open system, and therefore they won't reach a state of equilibrium. They will be continuously changing. So I'm going to leave it here for now. And we will address more questions in the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pablo. In terms of disorder, one little thing. I think the audience is hearing a little bit of a background noise sometimes when you move paper from your desk. So in the future, please stay clear of that. And thank you for your amazing and interesting insights from your recent book. I like how you were saying and showing also, and I think we can get back to that in the debate, how these social movements and these unplanned activities can also help the administration accomplish their goals. And I think we'll be hearing definitely more of that from our next speaker, which is Abad Ocubillo from San Francisco. So please take it away and we'll get back for the debate afterwards.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Pablo. That was very inspiring. I love talking about the open city. It's a really important concept for us as creative bureaucrats or tactical technocrats. So I'm here from the city of San Francisco, working in issues of the public realm and public realm policy to talk about what it means to innovate from within the technocracy. So currently I run a program called Shared Spaces. This is part of our city's response to COVID-19. And along with the public health crisis, we've seen an attendant economic crisis, of course, with the termination of commercial activities and dining indoors. We've started to move that activity out of doors. And so there's retail, entertainment, culture. It's been really wonderful to, at a really incredible scale, experiment with the public realm to create outdoor dining situations, something that's very much taken for granted in Europe, but in San Francisco is a kind of really a new experience for our local culture. So I'm not going to talk too much about shared spaces today, actually. I'm going to talk about how, as a city, we arrived at the moment where we could scale this radical re-innovation of our public realm. And when I talk about San Francisco and what's kind of endemic and special about us, I always like to bring it back to this kind of edge of subversiveness that has always been part of our kind of our outlook on life and civic life. I look to the late 70s, where installation artists like Bonnie Ora Shirk were creating these situations at freeway off-ramps, and in the middle, in the midst of this very heavily auto-centric urban environment. 15 years later, we had this installation, which was the genesis of our International Parking Day celebration. So that's something that was initiated here in San Francisco. And fast forward another 10 years, 15 years, and we're here. We have this typology, which we call the parklet, which is almost it's part of our local vernacular, really. Sometimes they can be very elegantly designed. There's some design here, but rather than get distracted by kind of the aesthetics and the beauty, which certainly many of our parklets create in terms of their situation, their materiality, I think the real story behind these individual sites, as well as them collectively, as a kind of population of sites around the city, tell a very interesting social and political story. They illustrate that narrative for us here in San Francisco, and the practice of urban planning, urbanism in general. So, just to get a little bit of theoretical, I'm coming right after a professor at the University City London, so I thought I'd throw in some theory. One of the ways that I like to think about what's the dynamic that's happened over the last 15 or 20 years is to go back to, this idea of strategies and tactics, this polemic that Michel Desserteau had set up for us, in the 80s, where strategies emanate from, the state. They're produced by institutions of power and imposed on everyday people, who then employ tactics to sort of navigate within that system. And so, I think it's certainly at the time that Desserteau was writing and what he was observing, that was a very germane lens through which to sort of examine systems of power and governance and citizen involvement in the production of our built environment, social fabric in our cities. But what we've seen with creative bureaucracy and with this sort of tactical urbanism is the convergence of these things. So, there's the producer and the consumer, as Desserteau had set it up for us. And that's really, converged in this new figure that's operating in government, in community institutions, the prosumer. And this is a phrase that was coined by Alvin Toffler in his work in 1980, writing about the third wave. And so the idea is that architects, landscape architects, designers, planners, mothers, people leading faith-based organizations, they've converged into this figure of the prosumer, a person who is helping to shape the environment in which their community operates, as well as being embedded within that. And so I describe this as a process of heuristic urbanism, where you take sort of grassroots, community-based, tactical urbanism, and the city facilitates that work and gradually absorbs those practices and those modes of production into policy, into law, into legislation, what have you. And I'll talk specifically about Places for People, which is the ordinance, the placemaking ordinance here in San Francisco that crystallized and codified this for our city. So much of this early work was predicated on the fact that streets are, a vast majority of the land area in cities. They're also that place that each of us touch every single day. Irrespective of class or gender or your background, everyone interacts with the public realm, and specifically the street. There's also this very important concept that, a small acupunctural gesture, whether that it's a temporary time-based kind of experiment or event, or a spatial intervention like a parklet, really does lead us to longer term change at scale. So in San Francisco, this thread of subversiveness picked up steam in the late 2000s, 2009, 2010, with these 8 experiments, 4 pilot parklets and 4 pilot plazas. And in the intervening decade, we've seen an explosion of many different kinds of experiments that are borrowing the same strategies of temporary community-based, place-based activation. Everything from urban prototyping on the sidewalk to re-examining the way that the travel lane next to the curb or the sidewalk can perform and its functions redoubled or tripled. Getting rid of street space in order to create places for people to come together and the like. So as we learned from all of these experiences over the last decade and we're contemplating legislation, formal city policy, I also found it really helpful to conceptualize the different components of this, of the way that our system of governance and placemaking works, using a rubric set up by Mona El-Kafif in her book, Staged Urbanism. So there are these four components that work in concert and interact with one another: orgware, hardware, software, brandware. And so, some of these are maybe really elemental and intuitive, right? Our hardware is our built environment, our amenities, our furnishings, our software, the people, the programs, the activity, the social life that takes place in place. And then we also have brandware and orgware. So brandware is a key component for us as creative bureaucrats to think very intentionally about, what is the human experience? What are the memories? What are the emotional attachments that we're helping human beings create for the places that they inhabit, and we help them produce. And then speaking from as the tactical technocrat, one of the areas that I'm most especially focused on is our orgware. So systems of policy and regulation, management and delivery, design, construction, the networks and institutions that not only affect a change in place and place governance and place knowing, but also sustain that place over time. So there are a lot of policies that came, from our parklet experiments, our mayor's pedestrian strategy, our Better Streets plan, our approach to eliminating traffic deaths related to traffic collisions. And so there are many different places in the public realm that we can operate, of course. So this very elemental diagram is actually really important because as bureaucrats, we know that our cities are, they're managed by many different legal jurisdictions. And each of these places in the public realm have many different parts of the bureaucracy that touch them. So the Places for People Ordinance, looked at everyone and contemplated everyone's role, as well as their charter or their code role, the way that our city code implicates them in management. There are also many other institutions who are involved in making these projects real, right? Everyone from art institutions to youth development institutions, these are all part of our place governance fabric and all have a role in shaping our experience and quality of life. And so it's also important to note that these private or arts institutions, they have an agenda, they have a civic agenda that can be expressed in the public realm out of doors. So, the short of it is we took all of those learnings and all of that contemplation and we wrote an ordinance. It was very detailed. We looked at many different aspects of our city code, as I mentioned earlier, our administrative code, our public works code, transportation code, police code, you name it, and very meticulously laid out where we would need to amend. Again, sometimes in just an acupunctural manner. So there's a corollary to the way that tactical urbanism happens out in the cityscape. When we're, when the technocracy is tinkering with the code, you can also just be one small gesture or change to city code can make a huge difference in how things actually operate and feel. So, we, through the system, the old system that we had, which really wasn't a system, it was an ad hoc kind of, collection of various different pieces of bureaucracy. It was very difficult for community-based organizations to implement this work and engage in communities. So we wanted to lower barriers to participation. whether they were financial or process. We wanted to see placemaking activities happen all across the city, not just in those parts of the city that were the most deeply resourced or the most affluent. We wanted to, create mechanisms for these communities to self-finance these projects. And so what that's meant on a practical level, moving from all of this theory down into the policy, into the regulatory, is that instead of the community partner having to take on so much of this responsibility, expense, and worry, much of that has now shifted through the ordinance back onto the city, so that our role is to help facilitate rather than stand in the way. So this drills down very specifically into many different types of projects. Again, empowering the community partner to make change in their neighborhoods. And so that is in essence that, how the Places for People Ordinance came together. And there's more information on this at sfplanning.org/places for people. So please check it out if you want to read our policy analysis or a brief for the ordinance itself. We're very happy for that to be shared out. I just want to close on one more thing, Charlotte, before we get into discussion, and that is that we've always known, but the events of the last year, both in terms of the climate related crisis, our health crisis, and social crises that are really at a kind of zenith right now, that social equity needs to be an important driver of the way that we as creative bureaucrats, as tactical technocrats, as urbanists shape our cities. And so our program has always been very intentional, I'm glad to report, about where we think we can make the most difference, working in the most vulnerable communities, those who are historically disadvantaged, not just disadvantaged because of COVID, but because of all of the pre-existing institutional and structural inequities associated with racism and discrimination, and all of these dynamics that we're working so hard to counter. So that also means that we need to study our public spaces, understand how they're performing, who's using them, youth, seniors, the difference between usership in terms of gender, so that we can very finely tune our work in order to achieve the kind of equity we need to see in our cities. So with that, I just want to say thank you for allowing me to be here with you, Charlotte and Pablo, and to the Creative Bureaucracy Festival for having San Francisco here.
Thank you so much, Robin. I think it's beautiful how you show that there's a lot of planning that goes behind the unexpected to happen. So we were here today, of course, to explore a little bit deeper how this contradiction can actually be solved, because I think what we see already in the term creative bureaucracy, it's Charles Landry often says it's an oxymoron, because often the bureaucracy is much more seen as much more rigid and working with accountability and predictability, probably also serving the public interest. On the other hand, we're seeing more and more cities making exceptions for these sort of more open cities where there's much more space for spontaneity. So I think it's very interesting. I would love to start with that with the both of you. How can you balance that contradiction in order to still make sure that within this unexpected field, there's still the public interest being served? Mm-hmm. Can I start with you, Pablo? Any reflection?
Sure. So I think that in the same way that you are asked whether creative bureaucracy is an oxymoron, Richard and I has been asked many times if the title of our book, Designing Disorder, is an oxymoron as well. And what we say is that it is not actually, because for either designing disorder or having more open institutions at the end of the day, which is what it means having creative bureaucracies, how to open up institutions, that needs to, there's a lot of effort that needs to be put on that. So it's not a matter of deregulation, it's actually a matter of putting a lot of effort to allowing spontaneity to happen. Because it's easy just to think that if you leave things loose and unregulated, things will just happen. Actually, when you leave things unregulated, what it could happen is that those powerful could take control. So I think it's important the role of institutions in being open is not just about pure liberalism. So we argue also that anarchism is not that. Anarchism is actually supporting small organizations and exploring ways of how to include them and how the institution can interact with them, and also let them explore creative ways and enable that they explore creative ways of transforming the city.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Robin, you were talking about.
Yes, there's always this tension between formality. Yes, thank you, Charlotte. There's always this tension between formality and informality, right? And especially in terms of the role of municipal government. And on the one hand, it's something that's beautiful, that's natural to human beings, you know, to sort of adapt and in a tactical manner, you know, use the system, whether that's a physical space, you know, built environment or other, to adapt that to your own needs. And so I want to echo what Pablo said in terms of regulation being a key component to places being truly equitable and accessible. So without some measure of social contract, and whether that's sort of defined and enforced by the municipal government with a capital G, or other systems of agreement, you know, we could definitely see those with more affluence or more power further consolidate that power to the expense of others. So there is a role for government, I think, is the short answer, right? That is our charge. And I think where we have more and more opportunity is to be a relatable institution, be an institution that you know, is intentional and open, rather than the maybe the closed one that, you know, has been kind of the hallmark of government for in many places for many decades.
Yeah, I love how you were saying being intentional is a large part of that. So I think I would love to go into the role of the creative bureaucrat there, because in a way you then say, I guess, that the creative bureaucrat also can be creative by being selective. So consciously, for example, empowering certain people or allowing certain people more space than others, maybe in order to create a more equal level playing field in the city. Is that something you can relate to?
Absolutely. You know, that is, you know, the government is responsibility, right? And we're responsible to everyone, irrespective of their economic class, what have you. So, and it is incumbent upon us as government to reverse and address the legacy of discrimination, inequity that our own institutions have created. So without belaboring it too much here, you know, in the States, there were practices of redlining and discrimination that have impacted certain classes of people for generations. And so that's a huge problem that in all aspects of our work, whether it's public realm and placemaking, land use or transportation planning, we need to address. That is our risk. It's our doing, and it's our responsibility to undo.
Great, thank you. And I think, as we've seen, of course, in the pandemic era, you've seen much more way for these types of adaptive planning structures to come about. How do you perceive, both of you, actually, the role, and what do you see changing recently in your fields, both maybe from the research perspective as well as the practical perspective? Pablo, can I start with you? Are you on top of the recent developments there?
Yeah, so the pandemic is bringing, well, in terms of research, is bringing a lot of challenges, actually. because a lot of my research deals with interaction with communities, and that has put and although we can do it through video conference, that has put a lot of limitations. Seeing a lot of deprived communities that I normally work with, they have limited access to internet. So I think this is also we also need to be conscious and not to romanticize too much the situation, because I think that it has also brought a lot of limitations. But on the other side, I think it has also brought really good examples of how mutual aid networks can help each other. And I think this is something that we really need to learn about, on how people have managed to self-organize in different places in the planet to help those that have more difficulties, how citizen platforms have emerged. And this is something that also we need to think about, how cities could prepare themselves, not only in terms of physical infrastructure, but also in the kind of social infrastructure that is generated. How, in a way, having a strong social infrastructure at neighborhood level also makes cities more resilient to situations like that.
Robin?
Yes, the global pandemic, COVID-19, and the attendant economic crisis and social and psychological kind of crises that ensue, are a real forcing mechanism, I think, for us to rethink not only the value of our public realm and our shared commons, but the way that government conducts itself, government business practices and transactions. So with the program I mentioned at the top of my presentation, the San Francisco Shared Spaces program, we took many of the pre-existing mechanisms we had for, either local merchants or other people in neighborhoods to, take over, a portion of the outdoors, and we radically streamlined them. So there's a whole new kind of calculus of risk, I think, when we're thinking about some of the customary issues, liability and safety and the provision of transportation infrastructure. That means something altogether when 60% of our local businesses may face closure. So the way that we're sort of weighing uses, appropriate uses of the public realm has radically changed, and that has forced us to rework our permitting and review protocols. And that's very exciting because, bureaucracies, as is the theme of this festival, can really get in the way, right, of empowering citizens, of letting them act. And so I'm really hoping that a lot of the experimentation in our business practices, in the way that we're operating as a city, persist past the pandemic, and that there really is some structural change to our regulatory environment that means a whole different type of city, a whole different type of urban experience after the pandemic.
Mm. And if you were to name like maybe 3 priorities that cities would do differently after the pandemic to allow more public interest to come back to public spaces, what would it be? Robin, can I start with you, because you've formulated the bridge almost already?
Yes, absolutely. No, I think so. Eliminating barriers. Much of the time that takes the form of permit fees, for example. When we're inveighing on a kind of a public or a private sponsor actor to build a public space, maintain and steward that public space in a manner that's accessible to everyone. There's no prospect, of course, of monetizing that space for personal commercial gain. They're creating an asset for the general public. We shouldn't also then have to charge them for doing that, right? So similarly, process barriers. how can we make that as easy as possible for them to do? So I'd say that's one thing that I hope persists past the pandemic. Generally, the radical rethinking of how the public realm is sort of apportioned and allocated. So this is a conversation, and it's kind of, an experiment that predates COVID, with the advent of many more different options in mobility, everything from scooters and electric bicycles and all of the new technology that's come about, as well as the way that folks access those new modes of transportation using, smartphones. And so we've been on a long trend of shifting the way that our roads are allocated specifically to vehicles. And I think we'll continue to see that tilt. And the pandemic, I think, is really advancing that in a manner that, is in an accelerated manner.
And your points, Pablo?
Yeah, I think I have the three of them. The first one would be around what I was mentioning before, around building social infrastructure and in terms of mutual aid. So how can we, and this is something that Richard and I mentioned in the book, based on some lecture that Richard Sennet gave in LSE in 2018, around how cities and welfare could work, could have, in addition to the layer provided by the state in terms of universal healthcare, housing, and education. So in addition to that layer, how the civil society could provide other layer in terms of mutual support that works more at the local scale. So that's one, the level of welfare in terms of social infrastructure. Then there's another one that it relates more to the physical, but also social infrastructure, which is understanding the importance of community assets. Community assets could be part of the public space, or it could be buildings, or could be different things. And I use an example of one of the groups that I collaborate with in North London, which is a community kitchen that before the pandemic provided free meals, free dinner on Fridays to everyone, regardless of income, class. So it was just kind of like a place in the neighborhood that provides free dinner without asking. And that was kind of like a meeting place, and where people from different backgrounds could meet, and people maybe that were facing the dilemma of whether to go to a food bank or not, went there without any prejudice. So that's, and during the pandemic, they've become the main source of food aid in the area. So those community infrastructure that at the same time was facing, I mean, that organization was facing the dispossession from the building that they occupy from the local authority. If local authorities realize about the importance of this community infrastructure that are citizen-led, and instead of trying to remove them from the building, trying to reinforce and help them, I think that's something very important that we need to learn from the pandemic, the importance of this community infrastructure. And of the space that they need in the city, and the infrastructure that they need in the city. And then the third one is connected with what Robin just said, which is the last point of Robin as well, which is the importance of designing cities where most of the movements can be done walking or cycling. So trying to, of course, remove the dependence of the private vehicle, but also try to start removing the mass dependence on local on public transport, going towards, not towards the private vehicle, but towards cycling and walking. And that means not just redesigning the street, but also redesigning the way we work and move in our cities.
Yeah, great. So you seem to agree on that, both cyclists, I bet. And with regard to those Civic support mechanisms for citizen-led initiatives, Pablo, can you name examples of what would be helpful? And I think Robin has a few as well.
Yeah, I've been working with various examples in London. I just mentioned the community kitchen, but I've also been working, for example, with or doing certain collaborations with these communities in the Westway through my research and through my teaching. And one example that I mentioned in the book as well is for example, when the Grenfell Tower, that is a tower that got into a fire because of a mismanagement of this social housing in London, and where at least 72 people died. When that fire happened in London, in North Kensington, the local community or a community group, a campaign group, occupied one of the spaces below the motorway in the Westway and turned it into a place for storing donations, but also for healing, and start organizing activities for healing of a community that had lost 72 of their neighbors. It was a community that was very tight, so losing 72 people was something very significant because they knew each other. So this space became very important, both for restoring donations, but also for healing. And it's a space that has continued. I mean, it's been 3 years since the fire, and they still continue organizing activities related to music, performance, different kind of workshops, and it's been a very important space for the neighborhood. So this kind of citizen-led initiatives, I think, that are essential for the city to run.
And what is the role of the city then to support these initiatives?
Yeah, to support them, to provide, to be able to provide spaces for, because one of the situation that at least what has happened in London, or what has been happening in London since 2010 mainly, is that communities are being dispossessed from their community assets. In this neighborhood in particular, in North Kensington, the local library was going to be leased to a private school. And the neighbors had to contest that, and they managed. They finally managed to stop it. Their local further education college was going to also be, in a way, sold to or merged to a much larger organization that would have kind of like eliminated a lot of the community work that the college was doing. So instead of dispossessing these communities from the community assets, they need to find ways of understanding the value that these places have for people and supporting people in developing the initiatives in these community spaces.
Excellent. Yeah, Robin, I heard you say earlier, of course, that it's about eliminating these monetary and process barriers, so making processes much more easy. I hear Pablo say access to assets is an important future for these citizen-led initiatives to thrive. Any more things that we can do as creative bureaucrats to stand by these great initiatives to come about?
Yeah, maybe one other thought, which relates to the last question you had as well, Charlotte, which is that arts and culture institutions are responding more and more in a deeply, truly civic manner. So at least here in San Francisco, addressing the institutional inequities that I referenced earlier, taking those on very squarely, and certainly the kind of tenor of public discourse in the States right now has brought a lot of that very much to the fore. And so, working with arts and culture institutions, whether they're museums or galleries or, groups who focus on film, performance, and music, there's a way in which, of course, art is able to offer an emotional experience that, goes beneath logic and cognition, and even in a space perhaps beneath emotion, and that's a very powerful way to access folks and to help create the kind of empathy that we need to survive not only this incredible moment in our world's history, but to become that just global society that we all strive for. So, and many different arts institutions have obviously different attitudes and ways of approaching this, but I think it's perhaps an undertapped kind of partnership or collaboration between government and this really meaningful and important sector. So,
thank you so much. Great addition to our list of sort of recommendations to cities to embrace in also in placemaking for recovery or city making for recovery. I think it's very interesting that both of you show, like Pablo was saying before, the fact that like this new way of working definitely means putting a lot more effort into allowing the spontaneous to happen. And Robin was saying it's about being intentional. We really have to round up already. It's been a great session, but I would love just some final remarks from both of you on your wishes for what the creative bureaucracy would look like from now on. Your greatest hopes to spur more self-organization, to empower more people to take action to make their cities better. What do we need from the bureaucracies? Robin.
We need our bureaucracies to downsize and to get out of the way.
Well, it's more hard work, so they have to work harder and be with less people.
But let me recast that. We need to eliminate as much bureaucratic process and regulation as we can, and I think that's an important gesture that we could make.
Okay, excellent. Pablo, final remarks.
Yeah, so just for not repeating again the thing on networks and municipalism, I think that what I would like to say is to encourage everyone to work. I mean, I think that, I mean, one of the things that if we see, for example, Robin's presentation, I think one of the key things that also we can see is that at the end of the day, institutions are also made by people, and that by having creative minds in institutions can change. So there's an opportunity for changing institutions from within. For example, I have a lot of very good students that have been after finishing the masters have gone into work for local authorities, and they're managing to introduce new creative practices in local authorities. And I think this is something very important, because the working in certain countries, working in local authorities has not been kind of like a very attractive jobs, and it's associated to kind of like the old bureaucrat. And I think we need to start claiming for that job of the creative bureaucrat that can change institutions from within. So I want to finish with that message.
Yeah, I think maybe then we need one more statement from Robin to tell everybody why it's so great to be a tactical technocrat. If you are recruiting your future creative bureaucrats.
I want to really underscore what Pablo mentioned. Our institutions are made up of people and human beings, and part of what is it's the great pleasure, actually, of working for San Francisco and as a public servant in California, that these institutions are filled with creative thinkers who really are committed to good government and practices of good government, and looking at every way that we can to revise how we conduct ourselves, in a manner that's more efficient and open. So, absolutely, this current moment in time in global history has shown that public service is more important and critical than ever. So, bring your creativity, bring your innovation, bring your ambition to government, because we need you. Our cities need you.
Thank you so much. And there's a big role for you to play to make a lot of public interest being met and a lot of impact to be generated. With that, I would love to thank Pablo Sendra and Abad Ocubillo for their great contributions. And I would love to close this session by wishing you a great day at the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.